how people have increasingly become proud of being Taiwanese first and Chinese second, if at all, how they're incredibly enamored with their own history, which is distinct from the history of the mainland. And I see very much the same dynamics playing out in the Indo-Pacific, driving Xi to want to invade Taiwan. But unlike with Ukraine, when I think it was too late to deter Putin, we still have time. I don't think that war is likely in the next 4 years.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Dmitri Alperovitch, who is a national best-selling author. He just released his book in April, World on the Brink, and it has already almost 100 very positive reviews. Dmitri, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I was attracted, I have to say, to your interviews and what you have written and said publicly, because you have a very direct and very to the point way of speaking about geopolitics, and also have a very unique knowledge of Taiwan, which I have to say is rare among people who haven't really lived here. But I know you've visited Taiwan, right?
I have, and I spent a lot of time talking to people in Taiwan, government officials and others, and have a deep interest in the region.
Yes, I can tell, because really your interviews are very insightful. If you could compare for us the Chinese and US technology and innovation area, because usually that's there is a big disagreement. How much better is the US versus China? How do you see it?
Well, I think you have to look at it technology by technology. In some areas, China is leading. Primarily, that is in the green energy space. They're leading in electric vehicles and battery technology, wind, solar, even in nuclear. And they're not as far along in other areas. For example, in artificial intelligence, they're behind and falling even further behind, in part because of U.S. export controls on advanced chips. In chips themselves, they're also quite a bit behind in terms of being able to produce the most advanced chips, although on the more foundational chips, sort of 20 nanometers and above, they're working to establish a market-leading position in the next couple of years.
Thank you. You also mentioned in your interviews, you said you wouldn't mention so much decoupling, but you would rather call it directional entanglement of China and the asymmetric dependence that the US should create. What is it exactly?
Yeah, so unidirectional entanglement basically means that we want China to be more dependent on us in areas like semiconductors, in areas like artificial intelligence, in areas like for example, biotech, and for us to be less dependent on them and reduce their leverage over us in areas like green energy, in areas like critical minerals, where they dominate the processing and refining markets.
From what I can tell, you're very positive about the Western development and chances still somehow to contain China. But it seems like China has a lot of domestic risks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the economic situation in China is not good at all. Obviously, you've seen the decline in their growth rates, precipitous decline in the last few years, where the growth rate is maybe 4% right now, just a tad higher than it is in the United States, and really no prospect of it coming back to the double-digit growth you've seen over the last 2 decades. Which means that basically China will never catch up with the United States. Their economy is about 25% smaller in terms of overall GDP at the same growth rates as ours. There's no prospect of them catching up. Now, on top of all that, you have the enormous property bubble. About 30% of their economy is real estate, compared to about 10% of the economy being real estate back in 2008 when we had our real estate crisis. So really, really significant risk ahead that China has not yet figured out how to manage. You have a fairly unstable banking system as a result of that real estate crisis, and really significant problems in their local governments that are financed in large part by sales of land to developers, which is now coming to an end. And you have this export-oriented economy that has failed to generate a substantial consumer market domestically, and is now confronting more and more trade barriers overseas, not just in the United States, not just even in Europe. There was a statement just this morning from a Mexican foreign minister saying that they're going to need to reconsider their relationship with China because it's not very reciprocal, and China imports a lot more to Mexico than it imports from Mexico. So you're seeing this backlash that they're confronting right at the worst possible moment for them, when they're still so dependent on the export markets and have not done anything to readjust and realign their economy. And then, of course, you have the demographics bomb that is coming in the coming decades, and has already begun in terms of the population collapse that they're experiencing and will continue to experience for the rest of the century, but has not really manifested itself in any of the economic data yet, because they're still so reliant on rural populations moving to the cities, increasing productivity. In fact, the third plenum that you just saw last week reinforced the focus on that. But you're going to hit a limit to being able to move those populations, rural populations, to the cities, probably in the mid 2030s, 2040s. And that's when you're really going to experience the full economic impact, the deflationary impact of the population decline.
I would like to challenge you here a little bit on that, because, for example, the EU economy, that's basically a service industry. In the US, the manufacturing base is basically in Asia. Everything was being outsourced. So I don't think really that you can compare those GDPs. We are very much dependent, the West, on Asian production. And a lot of the Western GDP is based, as I said, on services or maybe finances. So it seems to me like the Asian GDPs, I also mean China's, are kind of stronger than, or at least different than the Western ones. And when you see them now, BRICS getting together and bringing together, infrastructure projects and resources and manufacturing base, it seems to me like their offer seems actually quite good.
Yeah, I just don't see it that way. First of all, GDP is GDP, and jobs is jobs, and helping the lower income folks get into the middle class, however you do it, is obviously beneficial to your economy. And that's what China is really going to struggle with the growth rate that they're now experiencing, because they hit that middle income trap way too early, about $10,000 per capita, before much of the country has been able to really move into the middle class, and for them to become a rich country. In terms of manufacturing, well, first of all, there's a lot of manufacturing that's coming back, and I think a lot more of it will come back because of automation, right? Robotics, the revolution that you're seeing in autonomy, in part enabled by AI, is enabling a lot more factories to be coming back to Western countries and come back at a much more reasonable production costs. And also you're seeing friendshoring taking place, right? In part because of the trade war that was launched under the Trump administration, has been accelerated under the Biden administration. In part because of USMCA, you've seen a huge focus on manufacturing moving to Mexico, moving to Canada. You've seen a focus on developing closer relationship with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Malaysia. So yes, some of it is in Asia, but not necessarily in China, which is obviously not to the ultimate benefit of China. And then when it comes to BRICS, I mean, right now it's nothing more than a paper, not even an alliance, but a friendship, if you will. We have not seen any joint economic efforts by those countries. In fact, there's a lot of competitiveness inside that bloc, in particular India and China. India is decoupling from China very, very rapidly as we speak, and is doing even more than the US is, and they're both part of the BRICS. South Africa, Russia, and Russia in particular, is not able to really contribute a whole lot to the BRICS from an economic perspective, as they got their own substantial problems. And, others like Saudi Arabia, are seeking, as we speak, an alliance, a military alliance with the United States. So, we have to be very careful that BRICS is not yet, in any sense of the word, an economic bloc or a military bloc or even an alliance.
Okay, so we just discussed China's problems, but you also said in one of your interviews that we can wait the CCP out. So you mentioned that both sides are making mistakes and we should just wait because the timeline is in favor of the West. Are you really sure that that's enough? I mean, it doesn't look to me like the West is getting their stuff really together. Like the EU is really almost out of the economic race. The US has tons of problems. So I'm just less optimistic than you are. And so I wanted to ask you, where does your optimism come from?
Well, it comes from looking at the reality of the situation. Literally, today, China's GDP growth is about the same as ours. And if I were a betting man and look at the trajectory of the US economy, enabled by new technologies like AI, like biotech, in which we're leading, and China's, there's no question which one is much more likely to grow significantly in the coming decades and which one is not. And it's not China. So, you have to appreciate that China's economic miracle has come to an end. And unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, it has come too early for them before they were able to move to middle class, before they became a richer country. So, never count the United States out. It's still the world's largest economy. It is still the economy that the world depends on. When the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And it's remarkably resilient. It's really one of the few economies that have come out really, really well post-COVID, and with significant growth, so far having avoided a recession, and inflation has now come under control. So yes, we have problems, but it's a much more vibrant economy. It's a much more diversified economy than China's, that is really a one-trick pony in terms of exports.
You've also visited Taiwan, and I'm very curious about your impression and your experience in Taiwan. So how was it? What did you learn? What did surprise you?
Well, the biggest takeaway from my visit to Taiwan is really how the population there is really changing in their perspectives vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis themselves and their own history. How people have increasingly become proud of being Taiwanese first and Chinese second, if at all. How they're incredibly enamored with their own history, which is distinct from the history of the mainland. How they're proud of their indigenous populations and a revitalization of the culture and the food of the indigenous Taiwanese that have been on that island for 1,000+ years. So the interest in unification, which has always been on the decline, I think has accelerated even more so because of that pride that people have in their own nation, and they consider themselves having their own nation. And the polls really show these days that less than 7% of the Taiwanese public is interested in any unification with China, no matter when that might occur.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
I agree with you on that, but at the same time, living in Taiwan, I have to say, they really don't care too much about their defense, and that's really a problem. Like, I have to say, the Ukrainians, they got more serious about their defense after the first, attack from Putin, and I see this also in Poland. We're getting more serious now when Ukraine's situation is not that good. But I don't see the same involvement in Taiwan, and that to me is a little bit of a problem. They don't really take it seriously, like it's the Americans who have to die for them. So did you have the same impression?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true, although it's improving slowly, but it is. The real GDP spend of Taiwan is now somewhere around 3% on military expenses, once you count some of the extra expenses like the submarine, for example, project and so forth. They're revamping their reserve training, so going from about 4 months conscription to a year, and making sure that the training is much more realistic. So you're seeing progress. It is slow progress, and I think you're right that the threat perception is not very serious in Taiwan. They just don't think that China is going to invade, and this is from the government on down. There are some concerns around gray zone tactics, blockade scenarios. I don't personally view those as realistic at all for China in terms of accomplishing its objective of actually taking Taiwan. But the prospect of full-scale invasion, I think people just don't believe. And by the way, not dissimilar to Ukraine, because I spent time in Ukraine as well, and been talking to Ukrainians really throughout this conflict on an almost daily basis. And up until February 24th, 2022, most people in Ukraine did not believe that war was going to come. So that's another thing that's very striking. Is when I visited, I brought someone from Ukraine to Taiwan, and they told me we have such deja vu that this is just like what Ukraine was like in January and February in the lead up to the war. People just don't believe it's coming.
Great, thank you for that. There are still two topics I wanted to ask you about. One is the cyber threats and infrastructure. You wrote in your book that we do not have a cyber problem, we have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, certainly. When you look at where the majority of the cyber attacks are coming from, not all of them, but the vast majority, they're coming from those four countries, and it's not an accident. And I'm not just talking about nation-state sponsored attacks, which you're certainly seeing from all four of these countries: China, Russia, and Iran, and North Korea, but also criminal groups that are operating inside those countries. They're targeting Western businesses, targeting Western consumers and individuals. And the reason for that is that those countries are in a geopolitical confrontation with us, with the West. And not only do they encourage and order their intelligence services and militaries to pursue the interests of those countries that are also detrimental to ours, but they're also they don't mind looking away when the criminal groups that are operating inside of those countries targeting Western consumers. They're not interested in prosecuting them for that. In fact, on some occasions in countries like Russia, they actually encourage that and often actually hire them into government service when they're successful at prosecuting these crimes. That doesn't happen elsewhere, right? So there are certainly criminal groups operating around the world, but they're often found fairly quickly and prosecuted, and law enforcement tries to keep a lid on that activity. That does not happen in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. So that's why you see this emergence of both the criminal element as well as the nation state element being such a huge problem for Western countries and Western businesses.
So what can the West do? Because we definitely we don't have the awareness and the focus like, for example, China and Russia do. What could the Western governments do?
Well, in some cases, there's not a lot you can do. Certainly, when it comes to these criminal activities, there's fairly limited options if those countries are not going to prosecute them. But when it comes to commercial espionage against Western businesses, which I think is fundamentally the big issue that you're confronting in cyberspace, particularly from China, this massive intellectual property theft. I've called it almost 15 years ago, the greatest transfer of wealth in history that China has engaged in through their PLA, People's Liberation Army, and their intelligence services like the Ministry of State Security, breaking into companies, stealing trade secrets, stealing intellectual property, and then providing that to their domestic companies, both state-owned enterprises as well as private businesses. And what you need to do is ultimately go after the consumer of that data, those companies that are benefiting from that stolen IP, and you need to sanction them. You need to go after their business, and ideally you'd pick a huge company that you can prove has benefited from this and really destroy their business through financial sanctions, export controls, and the rest of them, to send a signal to everyone else that if you benefit from stolen intellectual property, from stolen trade secrets, not only will you not benefit in the global marketplace, your business will be destroyed.
Last topic I wanted to ask you about is the Chinese-Russian relationship, which you discussed in a very interesting way, that it's not really that solid, or that the Russians couldn't really get many concessions from the Chinese side. And you mentioned the recent communique where they discuss their solid relationship and friendship, but then number 2 and number 3, the second and the third point, discuss tigers and leopard zone and veterinarian standards. That is very interesting. Could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Well, it is a very transactional relationship. They're not allies. You know, people talk about China and Russia being allies. There's no treaty, mutual defense treaty, or any other sort of treaty between the two countries. And in fact, you know, if you look at the relationship with the U.S. with its closest allies, true allies like the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the so-called Five Eyes Agreement, there's not just a close alignment and the sharing of intelligence, which Russia and China don't have, but there's also a remarkable and unprecedented agreement not to spy on each other, a prohibition of espionage against each other. Well, Russia and China don't even have that. In fact, the number one case of espionage that has been prosecuted by Russian law enforcement in their country is people that are being accused of spying not for America, not for Europe, but for China. That tells you a lot about the trust or the lack of trust that exists between the two countries, and how they're suspicious of each other and really trying to use each other in ways that are beneficial to them, but also very wary of what the other is doing. And when it comes to the recent agreement, you're absolutely right. So President Putin, back in May of this year, visited China, famously getting a bear hug from Xi, and he brought along with him almost the entire Russian cabinet, many of the oligarchs that are running major businesses in Russia, expecting to really hoping, I think, to announce some big economic deals, Chinese investment in Russian economy, or opening up of imports into China from Russia, and he got none of that. Literally, as you just mentioned, the second item in the communique that was published was how they're going to set up this zone to protect tigers and leopards in Siberia, which is a great thing, but probably not the most strategic thing for either country. Align veterinarian standards to enable easier flow of tourists and others across the borders. But again, not something that's really tangible and is going to be a huge benefit to the Russian economy, which Russia desperately needs, right? It needs Russian investment, especially since so much of the Western investment has left the country. It needs more imports from China, particularly of Russian commodities. And one of the things that President Putin has wanted for a long time is the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to pipe Russian gas to China, particularly now that the European markets are largely cut off for him. And he still, even after years of pursuing this, has not gotten the Chinese to agree to it. So the Chinese are doing only the bare minimum to help Russia, and only that which is in their own self-interest.
Dear Studio Asian, if you've gotten that far and not commented nor liked, shame on you. Also sub for more Studio Asia.
Please allow me one more question. I'm really curious, since you just published your book, I'm really curious, what would you be researching in the remaining 24 and 25? Like, what's your interest now after publishing this book?
Well, the book really argues that we are a world on the brink, and that we are at, I believe, increasing risk of a conflict between the United States and China erupting as soon as 2028, when I think that China would have an opportunity to launch an invasion of Taiwan. I'm not necessarily predicting that they would in that time frame, but I think the risk is growing. And particularly that 2028 through 2032, I think, is a very, very dangerous window for that potential conflict. And we need to do whatever it takes to avert it, to deter it. And I believe it is deterrable. I was one of the first ones to have publicly predicted that Putin was going to invade Ukraine months before it actually happened. And I see very much the same dynamics playing out in the Indo-Pacific, driving Xi to want to invade Taiwan. But unlike with Ukraine, when I think it was too late to deter Putin, we still have time. I don't think that war is likely in the next 4 years, sooner than that, I mean. And 4 years is not a lot of time, but it is time that we can use to increase leverage over China, to build up capabilities of the Taiwanese to defend themselves, build up our own capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, and increase our deterrent to make sure this doesn't happen. This is still a very, very difficult and costly endeavor should he go for it. Very risky. The repercussions of failure are enormous for him personally and for the Chinese Communist Party. And we have ways, I think, to influence them, and we should try. And that's what I'm going to be focused on for the next 4 to 8 years minimum.
Dmitri, thank you very much for your time and your insights.
Thank you for having me.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.